I'd like to introduce our next panel, Rural versus Urban, EB5 Survival Payback Structure, Location, and TEA.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. This is not as dull a panel as you think it is from the title, I promise. We have a very interesting set of people here, and I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves. So I'm going to start at the far end. John Lamb, introduce yourself, please.
My name is John Lamb from Lamb Group. We are a hotel developer and hotel management, and also we own hotel.
Thank you. Payman.
Hello, my name is Payman Attari.
Can you speak into the mics, please?
Payman Attari. I'm the president and CEO of ASA Investment Advisors. We've been in the EB5 sphere for the past 5 years or so. Prior to that, I was involved in the emerging markets, so I've been involved in opening up some of the markets from Latin America to Russia and Eastern Europe. And I have to tell you that EB5 has proven to be just as challenging, and if not more so, than some of the other markets that I've been involved in.
Thank you. John.
Yes, my name is John Pratt. I'm a partner at Kurtzman, Weinkert, Tutselli, and Pratt in Miami, Florida. We primarily do litigation. We've been involved in EB5 litigation for many years. That's federal court litigation when some projects get denied, et cetera. And we do all different types of immigration litigation in federal courts. And we actually litigated the only precedent decision thus far in the Ninth Circuit on EB5, which is Chang. That's about it.
Well, it's not just about it, but...
Yeah, John's very busy these days.
Right. And Jeff, you never need any introduction.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Carr. I'm with Economic and Policy Resources. We're a service provider in the area of doing the economic and job impact studies. We also do business plans in the EB5 space and also do immigration business plans and other programs. And we've been operating in this space on a consistent basis since about 2004. So we've seen a lot of the evolution of the space over time.
Thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Aaron Goforth. I am a principal at Baker Tilly. We help on structuring EB5 offerings, the business plan, economic analysis. Baker Tilly Capital is also a registered broker-dealer, so we offer compliance and offering services to a number of our clients.
Thank you. So the main theme of this panel, the rural versus urban, is a little directed towards the investor who thinks, as we discussed in the first panel, that they should be only investing in urban, and should they invest in rural, and really what are the differences and what kind of impact would it make to the EB5 program as it is today. So we're going to take this topic and fragment it into different sections. The first of all, I'm going to ask our different panelists. I'll start with you, Payman. The word location. When they say about a project, it's location, location, location. What are you seeing in all of the deals that you do? How far does location really matter to an investor?
Well, I think it matters in several different ways. One is, of course, that a lot of investors looking at the EB5 world, looking for an investment, when you mention New York City, when you mention Miami, when you mention Los Angeles, they immediately know it, they recognize it, they know where it is, they're getting excited and interested about making an investment in these gateway markets. So that's one of the challenges when looking at projects which are not in the gateway cities, when you're looking at whether they are in some of the secondary markets and or even rural. That in itself becomes a challenge because just immediately the investors get turned off and not interested in really even assessing a project. So from that perspective, it does matter from an investor's perspective. Something obviously that I think that the industry should work on changing. And the other, of course, is that and something perhaps I can touch on a little later on, is that obviously, location, 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 especially when it comes to any investment, of course, does differ the risk profile of the underlying investment. And so it is important, therefore, to bear that in mind in terms of evaluating projects in different cities, in different markets. They all have their own parameters in terms of risk, which needs to be assessed for in order to assess the viability of the project.
Right, but what we're looking at right now is a push towards urban, a push away from New York City. Jeff, you have some points on this.
Well, I was going to just amplify something that Payman said. I mean, there are good places to locate a project in rural areas, and there are bad places to locate projects in rural areas. There are good places to locate projects in urban areas, and there are bad places to locate projects in urban areas.
Exactly, yes.
The issue is you want to assess the location of a project, regardless of whether it's in an urban or a rural area, based on how it affects its prospects for commercial success. If you're not going to have a project that's going to be commercially successful, you don't have a prayer of creating the jobs that are needed to support the immigration benefits of your investors. And so there's a natural, I think, inclination that Payman was talking about, that when you look at an investor in a foreign country that has, I mean, think about the knowledge that we have about China, with the exception of the people that go there chasing investors all the time. We know Beijing, we know Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, things like that. Like, the investors know New York, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And so think about what, you know, this whole urban-rural thing in terms of trying to find ways to create incentives for more capital to be directed into rural areas, or in the alternative, at least areas that demonstrate some degree of stress in the urban areas. We have to be sensitive to the fact of the people, of the migrants that we want to invest, and their perception of risk. So when we talk about doing EB-5 reforms, kind of like what the first panel was talking about, and believe me, I had the same visceral negative reaction to reducing the job requirement in rural areas that April had when that first started to be proposed. But the fact of the matter is that unless you focus in on the things that the investors perceive that's important, like the ability to get immigration benefits, if you don't make reforms that at least are sensitive to that, I'm not saying that we make them all based upon the needs of the immigrant investor, but what I'm saying is we can't ignore it, and we seem to be doing that in both the legislative arena and in the regulatory arena now, much to the peril of undermining an otherwise very successful program and creating jobs.
I agree with you, Jeff, but as was brought up by one of the questions in the first panel, how come it's all about real estate? Surely EB-5 is not about real estate. Aaron?
Yeah, so I think real estate has found a place because it's arguably easier to underwrite. So markets, hospitality markets, condo markets, there's a lot of third-party data. You know, you can have some assurance that, you know, your two priorities are being considered, your immigration risk and your financial risk. So with a real estate project, oftentimes there's a close nexus for the jobs potentially already have been created through construction activity. And then there's relatively easier underwriting for that type of asset, where rural projects arguably oftentimes are manufacturing and things that are less known of a quantitative asset. There's other experts on this panel that can speak to underwriting, but generally, I think the jobs associated with real estate projects make it a safer immigration investment.
And it's an easier proof, too, because if you calculate the number of jobs for EB-5 program purposes that are based on the expenditures that are needed to construct a project, it's a very easy prove at I-829 versus trying to assure investors that some level of operating revenue of a business enterprise 5 years out is going to be there. It's easier to show and demonstrate job creation, especially in this environment where if you say you're going to spend $50 million to build something, how many builders think that they're not going to spend $50 million plus about 20 to 25% nowadays?
Well, I kind of disagree with that, Jeff. I think it would be easier to show job creation in infrastructure or in manufacturing.
But infrastructure is capital heavy and labor light. Construction activity generally is very labor intensive and creates a lot of jobs. Infrastructure would be great, but what you have to do is you have to have EB-5 be a lower portion of the capital stack, because when you build a road versus building a building, when you're building a road, you got a few guys driving dump trucks going back and forth to the supplies. You got some person sitting on a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment. When you're building a building, you've got lots of trades and you've got lots of skilled people, and the jobs per $1 million in construction expenditures for going vertical construction is a lot higher than if you're building a road or laying in utilities.
But aren't these just the type of jobs that Senator Grassley doesn't want to see?
I'm not going to speak for Senator Grassley.
John, I know your firm deals a lot with litigation, and while we don't want to really frighten everybody with some of the litigation cases that have come up, on a more positive note, what are you seeing as far as projects which are being litigated from urban areas as opposed to rural areas?
Again, I just like to second what Jeff said. It has to make economic sense. And if it makes economic sense, then the two risks that are present in an EB-5, which is immigration and then obviously return of capital, can be satisfied. And then the question, once you get into federal court, really is about the inputs. And it's about how do you then prove these inputs, whether it's through expenditures or whether it's through revenues, et cetera. So, you know, from the aspect of a lot of the things that we've been involved in is actually SEC actions, whereby the SEC and now the receivers have been educated that there's a big component on EB-5, and that one of the main reasons to invest in EB-5 is actually immigration benefits rather than just capital preservation. So and one of the things that we've been seeing is how the receivers, and especially, for example, the receiver in the JP case, which has done an amazing job, has channeled different areas in order to be able to satisfy those immigration interests, in sometimes in lieu of a little bit more return of capital, for example, because the investment for a lot of these investors was to try to get this green card. As far as the dichotomy between rural and whether it's urban, to be honest with you, the cases that were involved, obviously, in JP, which I was involved in some of that, and in other cases, really mainly deals with proving, again, these inputs in order to then prove that the investors could get the EB-5 component satisfied by showing that there were enough jobs created or to be created by their capital. What happens, obviously, in SEC actions is a lot of the capital flew out of the project, and then what happens is, with a receiver successfully litigates and obtains some of that capital, there's a white knight in some cases that comes in and wants to do it. But none of these things happen without what Jeff said. Does it make economic sense? Is there going to be a return on the investment? And can the project be completed? So all of these things obviously are changing. I know Aaron has been involved in some of these areas too, and it's going to be challenging times going forward.
So we have somebody on the panel who has actually constructed a number of projects. John, how have you seen the job creation element? And I presume all of your projects are in New York City?
We mostly only invest in New York City. In New York, we are building involve over 50 buildings. So right now, one of the buildings right now we're building is a Virgin Hotel. So Virgin Hotel is about 460,000 square feet entire whole block on Broadway. So a bank appraisal is about $750 million on that building. So we have about 460 loans and 80,000 square feet retails. So the job creation, the study, so we're going to create about 3,500 jobs. So beside the construction, we're going to create a lot of jobs in construction. Besides construction, only hotel and a restaurant, we have like 4 or 5 different restaurants. That all create over 1,000 jobs, continue for work upward. So I think the job creation is very important. So our company is very conservative. We only want to do about 60% of even the study. You could do 3,000 change, 300 investors. We only do 200. So besides that, the location is very important. I'm in New York for doing real estate over 30 years. And the location is make the company successful or not successful because every 10 years, you see the market up and you see the market down. When the market down, which city will bounce back quicker, coming back? New York City. So I started to buy the first building in New York City. I spent $1 million on Marshall and Ken Helsian. That's my first building. Under $1 million. Today's value is $70 million. So the Virgin, that hotel, that land, I bought it in 2012. I spent $100 million. That time, no bank financing. We spent $100 million, bought the land. And the land today is worth 300 million. So my cost, only 450 million on my cost, but appraisal already come up with $750 million. So I only borrow money, 220 million from the bank, $100 million for EB5, about 200 member, even 100 sell. When the project finishes, you only borrow 50% from the bank. You got enough to pay the bank and pay all the investor. That's cost safe. We are old time company. Our company started in 1972. IC2 in New York City, up and down 4 times. So when the market up, we always hold the money. Our company only leverage less than 50%, all my project. So when the market down, we leverage all the way to buy in. That's why I buy $100 million worth of land in 2011, $100 million worth of land in 2012, $100 million spent in 2013. So only land value, right now we're building 1.3 million square feet in Manhattan area.
Thank
So-
you, John Payman. So here we are. This is Manhattan. It's
Yeah.
the most.
Right.
it's
All
the-
in Manhattan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so-
well,
but all the projects aren't in Manhattan, and that's big for
Absolutely.
argument, right?
Well,
Yeah.
you know, you said that we're going to make this panel interesting. So then let's start with that and let's put the cat amongst the pigeons. So I think some of you may have already heard me talk about this before, and we've kind of alluded to it as far as economic viability of any project is concerned. Of course, that is the basis of the investment. If you're making an investment, everybody has to assess the economic viability of the project you're investing in. But at the root of this is risk, and we've talked about risk. And so, as a little background, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in the normal world of investment, there is a direct relationship between risk and reward, risk and return, right? So if the risk of the project is high, one would expect a higher return from that. The EB5 world, of course, does not work on that principle because there is no financial reward to speak of. The reward, however, is a very important one, and that is the green card and the residency that the investors go for. So when it comes to EB5 projects, we are assuming, and which is true, that the outcome or the reward of all the projects are the same, which is the green card. So the only thing the EB5 investors are left to evaluate, many of them don't, but they should, are the risks of the project, right? So the logical thing to do would be to look for projects with the lowest possible risk profile. And this is what Sam was talking about in the previous panel. So, and that is the way it should be. And of course, when we're talking about projects in New York as compared to some of the secondary markets or rural projects, that is true. The risks of investments in outside markets would be higher, but the investors are not compensated for it. However, if you really think about it, the program was first, as far as the design of the program, it actually tried to compensate for that. The idea was that if you, the EB5 program is $1 million, you invest in a project in Manhattan, a luxury hotel, luxury development, you invest $1 million, great. But if you invest in a TEA, a targeted employment area, or in a rural area, you can reduce that by half to $500,000, which compensates the investor for taking the additional risk. So the project initially was designed to compensate for this risk. So what have we done? Markets do what they do. We've found loopholes, and in effect, as an industry, we've broken Humpty Dumpty. And so what the attempt is today for the legislators is to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So how do we do this? Well, we cannot look at the returns. There's no additional financial returns that's going to come. No project developer is going to pay any higher for EB5 funds than they are currently. So it would be to find other means of compensating the investor. One is that we've talked about is visa set-asides, and say, okay, there's a long waiting period now for regular, especially for Chinese nationals and some others that might be joining them, to have a visa set aside, which therefore they will not have this wait period. The other is the continuing differential between the investment in a urban priority area or in a rural area, which again compensates the investors for the additional risks that they will need to take in order to invest in a rural project, in a manufacturing project which has other risk parameters than a real estate project. So there are ways in which we can address this, and the idea is that find ways that can attract some of this EB5 money to go and invest in areas where it's more difficult to find financing simply because the projects are either riskier or do not have the same kind of returns as one would get in a real estate project in Manhattan, for example.
Thank you. Well said, Payman. The set-asides. Perhaps, Aaron, you and Jeff could just explain what are the visa set-asides which have been introduced in the latest legislation proposals. Aaron?
So there are proposed set-asides for rural projects and urban distress projects.
That's 3,000 visas, correct?
Yeah, so you're reducing, if we already have a retrogression situation with currently, imagine taking away 30% of the visa capacity for these set-asides. So I think it would have a very strong impact to Payman's point in terms of redirecting energy for investors to be focused on these marketplaces. But it's also going to create a much more difficult situation for the rest of the marketplace. So urban distress, I think people do appreciate that because it's very similar to the new market tax credit definitions. In fact, it's 2 out of the 3 to be urban distressed. And then
In the
there's
regulations, in the proposed
In the
regulations.
proposed regulations.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is not law yet. This is just a proposal.
Right, right, and the whole idea, obviously, by the permanent set aside, is to the early proposals in the legislative part of the reform effort were to, if those 3,000 visas out of the 10,000 that the program gets every year weren't actually used by the rural area projects or the distressed urban projects, that they, the following year, would go back into the general pool and be able to be eligible to be used by but they would still get their 3,000 set-asides for that upcoming year. That dog didn't hunt.
Right, and where are we looking at for set-asides? I mean, can you give some locations? What is a typical location for a set-aside?
Well, I mean, we're going to open up a can of worms here. There's 2 types of TEAs, as Payman was talking about. One is a urban distress TEA, which meets under the reform proposals and the proposed regulations a couple of tests: poverty tests, household income test, and an unemployment rate test. Right now, current law only includes the unemployment rate test. In order to be high unemployment rate TEA in a non-rural area, okay, remember, the first cut of the apple in determining a TEA is the project located in a rural or urban area, and it's a yes or no decision. If you are in a county that's in one of the 380 some odd metropolitan statistical areas that the U.S. Office of Management and Budget of the Office of the President says is a metro area, then your only option is to do a high unemployment rate TEA. If you're in a rural area, that means you're not in a county that's counted in one of those metropolitan statistical areas. You only have one other test. You can't be located in a municipality that has 20,000 residents per the previous decennial census, which in this case is the April 2010 census. So unless you're at 19,998 residents, if you're not in a urban defined county, then your TEA for rural areas is pretty stable. Most people in the marketplace don't understand that unless the OMB redesignates a county that your project happened to be in that previously wasn't in a metro area and puts it in one for whatever reason, and they don't do this very often. Yeah. They only redefine or maybe update metro areas about once every 3 years. You're safe for 10 years until the next census. But in an urban area, you have to go through the process that the state currently determines is the way that they determine TEAs. for high unemployment rate areas. And for if it's not a county-wide unemployment rate that qualifies, if it's not a city or a village or a town-wide unemployment rate that qualifies, we have the ability to use sub-municipal regions and blend them together with a project location called census tracts or even census block groups in order to get a blended rate that might be 150% of the U.S. average. And typically states do it on the basis of last calendar year's unemployment rate data. Most departments of labor actually allocate their labor force employeds and unemployeds down to the census tract level on an annual basis. And that's how an economist knows it's spring. It's not that the days are getting longer, that the days are warming up. It's that the Labor Department allocates the employment and unemployment data to the census tracts. So what happens there then is you have to be worried if you have an unemployment rate that's close to the 150% threshold. Every year they update this data in April, May, and some states in June. There are still a few states that use July 1st to June 30th configurations. And so your TEA, if you have a substantial raise, you could lose it from year to year. You have to recertify it every year because remember, the TEA only is valid at the time the investor irrevocably invests their $500,000 or files their I-526 petition. So that's TEA 101.
Yeah, now you can see why we don't argue with Jeff when it comes to certain issues.
But TEAs are flawed.
Right, I
They
was
are
about to come
flawed.
to that. So it's might seem an obvious question, and a lot of people do understand this. But there's a lot of people out there, Aaron and Jeff, who just don't understand. How can you have a hotel in Manhattan to be a TEA? How?
I'm glad you asked that question, Mona. The high unemployment rate TEA confuses two employment concepts in economics. It tries to determine an area based on where the jobs by place of work are at the employer and conflates it by where the workers that are in those jobs actually live. And I anticipated this question, so let's just look at the offending census tract in Lower Manhattan. It's Census Tract 99.
We're talking Lower Manhattan, where John has some of his
Lower
projects.
Manhattan.
Okay.
And you can look at data from the Census Bureau. Actually, there's something called the longitudinal employer household dynamics data. What they do is they look at the number of jobs that are in a census tract, and then they look at where the people who hold those jobs live. And the offending census tract, at least in 2015, Census Tract 99, had 30,146 jobs in that small little area in the lower part of Manhattan. Now, it only had, out of those 30,146 jobs, only 164 people who held those jobs in that census tract actually lived there. About 60% of them, that's like 17,900 of them, commuted up to 10 miles to fill those jobs. Another 24%, or another 7,300 people, which means 85% of the people who held those jobs in that census tract commuted another 10 to 24 miles. So 85% of the people who held those jobs lived within 24 miles. The other 15%, which isn't insignificant, almost 5,000 people, lived more than 25 miles away. It's because when people hold jobs in the hotel project or where people build those hotels, they don't live in the basement or the attic of the building that they built with their families. They live where they live. And many people in Lower Manhattan that hold jobs down there live in Connecticut, Westchester County. They commute long distances. The TEA does not take that into account. It counts only the people that live there. And then we have to make it contiguous. And so everybody argues that, and Professor Friedman, you've done this, what are all those people in that, in the offending area up in the Harlem area, what do they have to do with that unemployment have to do with Lower Manhattan? Well, the fact of the matter is those offending census tracts that everybody called gerrymandered are only 8.5 miles away from ground zero at Census Tract 99. So the point is, they're well within commuting distance, but the problem is our TEA doesn't take that into account unless we're able to capture those areas where the people who actually hold the jobs live. In a world where we have new TEA reform, where we can only count the census tracts that are adjacent to the tract where the project is located, it totally ignores the way labor markets work. And I'm on my soapbox, I know that. But the fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is
you can jump in.
Well, and I absolutely agree with Jeff's point here, and an argument has been made by quite prominent people that the skyscrapers in Manhattan are the factories of Manhattan, where a lot of workers come and work at, and especially for the construction, and they, of course, come from the surrounding areas and the commute to do that. And absolutely. The EB5 program, though, does not prohibit the investment of EB5 funds into projects such as that. What it says is that put the $1 million in to build that luxury project in Manhattan. It creates the jobs. Come on in. I think there's a difference between just the job creation aspect and actually locating a project within the distressed urban area and the impact that it has, the economic development impact that it has in that specific location, in addition to the jobs that it creates. And I think that is part of the intentions of the program, to actually direct the investment to be made in those distressed areas and or rural areas where the economic impact far exceeds just the jobs that are created by that project. And again, it's not a fact of say that the EB5 should not go into luxury projects, into projects in Manhattan. Absolutely. There's just ought to be a differential in order to, first of all, accommodate the difference in risks that the investor would take for a project that's not situated in a primary market or a gateway market, and also to encourage that investor, given the other types of incentives that one might be able to put in order to take that risk and have that investment in that distressed urban area.
But if we want to help the workers, and the workers who hold the jobs in the area that's distressed, how can we have a TEA policy that doesn't capture where they live? The reason I've been told that we don't do it this way is it's too complicated. We'll extend the adjudication periods even longer. Well, so what we're going to do is we're going to essentially make policy on North Korea based on how it's going to play in rural Indiana.
John, you had a point.
Yeah, I built a hotel only in Manhattan, and as you know, I just formed an association and a president, and also we partnership with NYU, CBC is a Chinatown Penal Council, and also local community school. We take community, we want to give job to community, all to local school, training the people from the local area to go back to the hotel job. That's our big push in that issue. All my hotel is around the area. We are teaching people from the school and employ them and teach them come in. And a lot of students, they graduate, they get a job in the area. So in whole Manhattan, it's only 10 miles. So in that building, in there, they're definitely right. In Finance District, no apartment there. So Finance District is different story. They may have apartment in Bell Park, but most of rich people living there. But they have enough also a project in downtown area. We train a lot of government workers. Government workers right now singing in New York City. We have I have a personal government association. I have 35,000 workers working for me in government industry. So over 30,000 people lost their job. I was training over 10,000 people from the government industry back to the hotel industry. It's on record. So that's why we create a lot of jobs in local, and we I figure for myself it's not enough. That's why I formed an association. Last Wednesday on the 8th, November 8th, we just a party. It's over 100 hotels join my association, want to create job in local. Yeah. And there's a lot of politics coming in to help me to big push how to get more job in Manhattan. And we serve the community. And that's why we have big fight with the union. They want seniority. They may have a job for a long area. But I said, I don't care about what the job for seniority. I care about job for community, and let people lost their job have opportunity to find a new job for. I'm an immigrant. That's why I get a job, I save my money, and start a business. I focus to get opportunity for immigrant, for community people, and also students. That's what I'll focus into.
John, Aaron, how do you feel that these big factories of the luxury buildings being the factories of the people, how do you feel that that adds credibility to the EB-5 program as you see it today? The very fact that so much has been brought forth to the urban community. So many of the visas are taken up by the urban community as opposed to rural.
Well, I do some lobbying on behalf of AILA, on behalf of the AB5 committee, and obviously there's a tension between different congressmen in different parts of the country, to be quite honest with you. And this is the whole impetus is maybe some immigration reform, is that it comes into the EB5 arena. Before there was a regional center, there was EB5, and before they had that concept, and they thought 10 jobs, your $1 million or your $500,000. That's how they thought of it. And when you look at the legislative history of initially how the program came about, they wanted to then make the incentive of a lower investment in order to increase investment in areas where people would not invest. And obviously, some feel in Congress that I have spoken to that the program was never truly intended to be used this way.
But it has, and since it has, it's brought in 4 times the amount of money, if not more, 10 times. Nobody expected the EB-5 to bring in the kind of capital that it has.
No, I completely agree.
We can really bring that.
I completely agree.
Yes.
I mean, one of the toughest things of doing when you're doing lobbying in Congress on any immigration issue is when you are meeting with a member of Congress and he says, I don't want people buying green cards. And I said, but that shouldn't be the narrative. The narrative should be the 3,000 jobs that were created in your district. And that's part of the problem that's happening in today's world in essence, is that it depends on how you do the narrative, and I agree with you that a job is a job is a job, and regardless of where that job is created and what kind of inputs that you use, whether it's revenues, expenditures, etc., it has this ripple effect, as Jeff correctly pointed out. The job may be somewhere, but the person may be somewhere else, and not to look at the overall economics effects of the program. I think it's a naive way of looking at the program, not a realistic way, and an economic way. The only other thing that I wanted to add is, one of the things in assessing this from the perspective where I'm at, is the investor needs to do some due diligence on the EB-5, because if the investment is capped, or if the investment is guaranteed to be returned, immigration is going to have a problem with that. And if you don't get your immigration benefit, then you have other ripple effects too. But to answer your question, I think obviously it's our job as an industry, as lawyers and different trade organizations, to teach Congress all the positive things that EB-5 is doing and will be doing,
right.
Including increasing some of the numbers, to be honest with you, from some of the countries, especially China.
Aaron?
Yeah, it's the political construct is just unfortunate. We have a program that brings direct investment into the United States. It creates jobs for those people that decide to invest. And there's a ripple effect there too. These people bring their culture, they bring wealth with them, they educate their families here. It has an amazing benefit. And the fact that we are in this political impasse over a TEA seems to be really, trying to win a battle and lose the war. We have bigger issues like visa cap, which I don't think can be taken on at this time, but there's bigger things that can be accomplished. The rural versus urban construct, I understand the realities of the political world that we're in, but if a project is a strong project that can be underwritten, that brings direct investment to the United States, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Let's get over the other piece of it. And I don't know that we need to put, excess. When the market has shifted here for a reason, because people want financial return and the immigration benefit. Right. If there's a strong project that's steel manufacturing, that could be anything that's well underwritten and creates the jobs, invest in that project. Mm-hmm. So I think in some ways, what we see today, when I started in EB-5, you had fish farms, you had gold mining, you had a whole array of really kind of wonky projects that needed alternative capital. Today we're in a more sophisticated place that we have projects that are well underwritten, they're going to create the jobs, and there's a high likelihood that they're going to have their capital returned. So I don't think the evolution of the program has necessarily been a negative thing, especially if you think about the investors.
But what about those projects which really need financing and aren't able to get financing from alternative means, like from banks?
There's a place for that. And to John's comment earlier, this cycle will run its course, right? And there will be people looking for EB5 for potentially first position money on a more regular basis. But there's a place for that. And we see a lot of like what I consider friends and family projects. You know, someone's from India that has connections back to a wealthy family, and they're doing a startup tech security company. There's a place for that. And I think, you know, there's should be room for those visas for everybody that participate in the program. And then the only good thing I see about this political discourse is disruption. So as much as it's nice that we've got this kind of steady state, you know, I do think there's an argument that we need diversity in the project types. But I'd rather see the market drive that than it be regulated.
Okay.
Well, you know, I think just on that, of course, you know, I guess my issue is that we're defying a lot of economic rules and market rules when it comes to EB5, right? One of them is this adjustment of risk. And the fact is that if there's the same amount of money and no other incentives, I wouldn't advise any client of mine to go into a manufacturing or any project that has a higher risk than, let's say, a luxury hotel development in Manhattan. It just doesn't make any sense. So there has to be some adjustment in terms of the risk that the investor is taking and to incentivize them to take higher risk in a project. And the other is that, and I think, you know, we've alluded to it, look, this has been a very successful program. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of money has been invested in the United States through the EB5 program. And so, but the program also has not adjusted for that. I mean, I would equate the situation the same as trying to get Hamilton tickets in New York, right? I mean, I think that, you know, the theater has a certain amount of capacity. It has a certain amount of seats. If those seats are sold, like me trying to get tickets for Hamilton, I have to now wait until 2020 before I get to see it.
They could scalp.
Right?
They could scalp tickets.
Ticket scalping, right. So, but if you're prepared to pay, as was advertised, if you send money to Channel 13, $3,000, and you get 2 tickets to Hamilton, right? So that's normal adjustment in the market. In other words, if you get to capacity, and there's a lot of demand, and we hit EB5 capacity as far as the number of applications are concerned back in 2011, 6 years ago we hit capacity, yet since then more and more petitions have been sold, and not sold, but have been placed. So, but the price has not gone up, right? And we are arguing the fact that we shouldn't increase the prices because we're going to dampen the market.
Should we restrict visas in certain areas? I have this question for each one of the panel. For the survival of EB5, what about the proposal of restricting how many visas, say, New York City is allowed, and how many visas Philadelphia is allowed? It's illegal. Well, if one could do that, if one could do that, what would you suggest?
Well, I wouldn't be in favor of that. I think that's, you know, I think there is a math. There's again, the market approach is that there's an adjustment for risk. And I'm absolutely in favor of, if possible, to actually expand the number of visas for EB5 because it is a program that is working. There's no doubt about that.
But even with expanding it, Payman, the argument is 70% goes to New York City and the big cities. That's not fair.
Well,
that's the whole point here.
If we have an adjustment, you see, that's where
right.
we need this adjustment for the risk, right? If there's an incentive that an EB5 investor could be shown that says, here is a project that is economically viable. It's going to create the jobs. It's going to do everything that's required to satisfy the immigration matters. But you know, it has a higher risk than investing in a project in New York City or another one of the primary kind of gateway markets. There are going to be investors who are prepared to take the advantages and incentives to invest in those types of projects and not just in New York City projects. So it really comes down to the incentive.
Don't you think the incentive could be from the project developer to offer additional return or have an equity type structure?
That would be fantastic. I mean, if anybody could persuade the project developers to actually pay more for the EB5 funds, absolutely. But there is a limit to that because it's a process to raise EB5 funds, right? So when the cost of the EB5 funding starts getting close to market costs, why would anybody go through, jump through all the hoops in order to raise EB5 funds where they could actually go to their local investors and or their bank and raise the money? So I think absolutely, I think there should be where there is some adjustment to the returns to the EB5 investors, but because of the fact that there is a limit, it's going to be difficult for EB5 investors to compete with the market.
We might end up seeing this naturally once the minimum amount is raised. John, how many large-scale luxury projects are litigated?
Well, again, and I think you need to be careful on how they structure these things, because there's different litigation in different aspects. Obviously, the SEC has gotten into the game and has, as the previous panel was saying, there's construction projects where they were just completely manipulating the economics of the project and then manipulating the inputs that were going to be used. So, for example, they were saying that a construction, was going to be $100 million when it really wasn't, and they were inflating certain of the line items, etc. That's outright fraud. But some of the other things that we have seen in litigation is when a project is too eager to put a cap on that gain, or to cap how much the EB5 investor can come in, because USCIS says that this has to be at risk of loss and risk of gain. And if it looks like you're putting a cap, it kind of looks like more like a loan, and it could be a debt arrangement, and you run afoul of EB5. So you could do all your raising and all your et cetera, but then immigration wants to deny you're 100 investors. Well, that goes your $50 million on EB5 that you're not going to get through, and then you have to try to litigate. So it has different components, to be quite honest with you. Sometimes they're just too aggressive in some of the offering, under some of the documentation, in capping or looking more like a simple debt transaction. And obviously, you're dealing with the issues of we're in a regulated industry. And, immigration sometimes wakes up and says, well, you know what, a loan proceed that is not guaranteed by the investor's capital is no longer good, when for years they were accepting it, or tenant occupancy, which was a way of calculating jobs from some real estate projects. Then it wasn't good enough anymore. They woke up one day, and then that leads to litigation. But so I think, honestly, from the perspective of the investor, they really need to do their due diligence both in immigration, the economics of the project, and how likely is it that it's going to get approved, because that's what they want. They want the return of capital and their immigration benefit.
All right, well, before we have closing remarks, I know there's a lot of questions. Yes, could mic, please? To the mic. Professor, I know you have an issue as well.
I know you do. I think to minimize the risk.
Can you speak into the mic, please?
Did I do that? Is it working now?
Yes.
To minimize the risk for EB5 investors is, I think, infrastructure project will bring the security they're looking for. Federal government participation, municipal government participation, local, state and city governments outside of major cities. You don't build roads in the middle of Manhattan, you build them outside in rural areas. And it's just as sophisticated to build a road as it is to build a skyscraper. There's much more into building a road than into that almost as much as building a skyscraper, creating a lot of jobs. I think putting infrastructure project as the #1 priority for EB5 will save the EB5, will bring federal government financing, state and municipal government participation, whichever vehicle they use, bond issue. I think that's the emphasis of our work from now on. That should be.
Jeff, you're shaking your head.
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree. Infrastructure projects have a lower labor intensity by their nature than vertical construction. They don't generate as many jobs per $1 million of expenditure as construction projects that involve vertical construction do. It's demonstratable. What's
Trillions, not just millions of dollars, trillions.
Well, so you're going to make it up on volume, and that's okay. I mean, you have a higher volume of things, but you can't argue that infrastructure spending has the same labor intensity and the same amount of jobs created per $1 million as construction. regular vertical construction does.
And you're right, and I don't think it does. But if I may just add to what you were saying, and that's very true. But what we're looking at are ways in which EB5 funds could be used effectively, not just to create jobs, although that is a main component of it, but also to spur economic activity. Infrastructure, I mean, it certainly roads and bridges are part of infrastructure, tunnels, but you know there are so many just in the state that I live in Kentucky. There are, for example, so many water treatment facilities that need to be either built from scratch and or upgraded in order to provide a very, very valuable service to the community. Now, those are the kind of projects that one can structure together with the involvement of either the state agencies and or local agencies, where potentially EB5 funds could come in at the kind of current costs that EB5 comes that really make quite a lot of impact on that community. And, you know, obviously the job creation element has to be part of it. There's no doubt about it.
And it obviously addresses the uncertainty, the commercial uncertainty aspect of steering projects into rural or non-urban areas. And I completely agree with that. The other thing I wanted to say, Mona, if it's okay, is the first panel talked, and there was a question about, you know, why should this program be successful? One of the things that we don't measure in any of our job impact studies or anything like that are the 10,000 new consumers that come in every year under the visas, where, you know, many times these are affluent consumers. They buy houses when they establish their residency. They buy cars. They purchase lots of things to maintain their household. And the only impact study I think I know that does that is IIUSA does one, where they actually try to estimate the value to the economy of the 10,000 investors that come every year. And most projects, unless you're double counting jobs, which some studies do, most projects in the EB5 space actually create a lot more jobs than we could bring into the EB5 program eligible funding formula to go in the 10 jobs per investor math. And so one good way to deal with that is let us count all the jobs that the projects actually create.
Yeah. Professor, you had a...
Absolutely do.
Professor, you had a question or a comment? Can you speak into the mic, please? Yes. I'm sorry. Can you? Yeah.
Is that it? No.
He just doesn't want us to know he agrees.
I agree with both Jeff and this gentleman about infrastructure and the need for it. Just keep in mind that you have to deal with the political reality. And under the reform bills,
can you speak into the mic? Sorry.
Under the reform bills, the infrastructure was going to be treated as a TEA.
Right.
That's been eliminated. In addition, the reform bills provide that a NCE cannot deploy the EB5 capital to purchase municipal bonds if they're publicly available.
If they're marketable, yeah.
If they're publicly available, which most municipal bonds are. So there are ways to get around that. The question is how narrowly that will be interpreted. So certainly there's no incentive that's being proposed any longer by Congress on that issue. As far as the positive effects of the program, there's no question there's positive effects. Just keep in mind, in terms of the number of jobs that are created, all of the jobs that are created by a project are allocated to the 10 to 30% of the project that's funded by EB5.
Well, you mean from the non-EB5 capital stack? Yes.
Yes.
But the 10 jobs per investor math is not straightforward.
Oh, that I understand.
There are rules which exclude certain types of jobs that aren't sufficiently permanent, for example. If a construction project doesn't go 2 years, all the economically direct jobs are not eligible.
It's still allocating 100%. But in the other question I would have, for example, from Mr. Lamb, there's no question that his projects create a tremendous number of jobs. And the question I would have is whether, if EB5 weren't available to him, whether those projects would be able to be built and create the jobs with some other kind of capital.
Well, a lot of jobs created by the construction and also supplies. And after finishing, we still create over 10,000 1,000 jobs in hotel by themselves, with the restaurant, with all the pay area.
But John, his question is that if you didn't have EB5, would you not create those jobs anyway? Well, how has EB5 helped?
If I don't have EB5, we cannot build too many projects. That's the
Because
issue.
you could
I
have
still building,
more funds available.
It's
to,
more
to-
funds
to
available,
invest
yes.
in new
but
projects.
because E5 help us be quicker to build and create job quicker in the area.
Right. So the real question, though, is how to create an incentive for investment in the rural projects. Because as Aaron points out, they could offer a higher interest rate, but obviously the rural projects can't afford
Now,
to build to begin with. To expect them to pay a higher rate than a luxury project in an urban area, I think is
Arguably equity too, right?
Yes.
paid by whom? Paid by whom?
Developers are paying 4, 5, 6% rate of funds. Most of it goes to migration agents.
Yes,
The investor himself gets a quarter of a point of zilch.
I understand that.
Shift this interest from migration agents.
Yeah, it's a different issue, but
Make it more
the other
Yeah.
question I would have for Jeff is with respect to the idea of counting job or defining a TEA based on the commuter traffic patterns and job creation and things of that sort. If you applied that type of approach, what percentage of the projects in New York City for Manhattan, for example, would probably qualify? Would it be a high percentage or a low percentage?
Haven't done that work, but
Yeah.
if they qualify, they should qualify, Gary.
But then the question then is, if they do qualify, how is that going to facilitate the whole incentive of promoting capital in areas that can't otherwise afford
Well,
it?
I think I think the EB5 program to be designed to be a big tent for everybody. I think there are other things that you can do to encourage projects to go into distressed and rural areas, and I think the industry's been debating them, and I think the legislative proposals that have been coming off of the Hill have a wide variety of things that, not surprisingly, in an industry that has a lot of diverse interests, hit some people one way, hit other people the other way. I see the value of focusing on the immigration benefit to the rural investor and trying to do something even aside from set-asides that might encourage and lower the risk of job creation, for example. I'm not proposing that we do that because I still viscerally am concerned about reducing the job requirement, but I see the reasoning behind the argument that you might make rural projects not have to do 10 jobs per EB5 investor, maybe 8, maybe 5 to me was a negotiating point from the senator from Iowa. And you have to make the four corners of this debate buy in. You have to have the ranking member and the chairs of both judiciary committees and both chambers, or we don't have a prayer.
Thank you.
yeah, we have a question down here.
Yeah, so quick question. There's been a lot of discussion on different types of incentives to help offset some of the potential risks associated with a high distress, urban distress, or potentially rural project. And I think, Payman, you did a great job explaining the differential or a meaningful differential, how that provides incentive. I have a question as it relates to the visa set-asides. So if indeed, and it's important because it seems that perhaps legislation discussions have kind of landed on this idea of a visa set-aside. Certainly it creates incentive so long as that increases or decreases the amount of time the investor waits for their visa. Given the numbers of investors investing in the program, at some point that also will be backlogged. Once that becomes backlogged, the incentive starts to diminish. My question to the panel would be, what is our best guess until, are we talking a couple months? Are we talking a couple years? How long will that actually provide incentive to rural projects before it's diminished because it's also backlogged?
Payman, you can start.
Well, very good question. Frankly, I don't know. It really depends on the volume and the number of petitions that are filed and actually choose to invest in projects in rural areas. So, obviously, if the minimum amount is increased as well at the same time, that's going to affect the number of investors who would be interested to invest through the program. So, it really is something we have to wait and see. If the popularity of the program continues as it is, if we're talking about 3,000 set-aside visas as compared to the 14,000 petitions that we're getting every year currently, it won't take long before we start hitting backlogs, basically. So it's definitely it's something that I know already projects are being marketed in places like China, hoping that there is going to be this legislation. It might be a little too risky to try and assume that there is going to be any legislation at all. But in any case, I think that it's the variables are going to be very important as to how that affects the market, but it's likely that we're going to get to capacity.
And that brings up a bigger point too, right? This program was pretty inactive until the regional center pilot program was introduced.
Correct.
And how elastic is this, right? From a price perspective, from a weight line perspective, and from a risk perspective. We may regulate ourselves or advance law that just puts us to a pretty quiet room in the future if we're not careful.
Jeff?
I'm not sure I can agree 100% with the premise of your every question. My concern would be that we would have these set-asides and they'd be permanent, and we wouldn't get enough deal flow for the rural or urban distress set-aside, and all we do is make the program overall smaller, because my concern is that a lot of the reform proposals that have been proposed to quote-unquote incentivize rural areas or non-urban projects have basically been driven by we have to eviscerate the deal flow in 70% of the marketplace and hope that investors will then turn to rural projects as a viable alternative. And my concern with that is that I'm not sure that the only other alternative are rural projects in the United States.
Yeah.
I'll just
Good
simply
point.
add to this. I'm not very hopeful that there's going to be any legislation.
Well,
in
yeah.
anything. So to be quite honest with you, they don't even make it permanent. They haven't even made it permanent. We're got now December. They're going to kick the can, in my view. So there's just too many competing interests at this juncture, in my mind, in Congress, in order for them to coalesce. There, even as an industry, there hasn't been a meeting of the minds, I think, in my opinion, in some of these issues. So. The problem with the backlog is a huge problem. I think that the administration, administratively, they could have done something which is counting just one investor instead of his whole family, and their support for that. But I'm just not, I think it's very good intellectual discussions of how to incentivize capital into certain areas of the economy, whether it's for projects or areas or whatever the case may be. But I just don't think that there's a meeting of the minds in Congress to do anything.
I mean, we wouldn't even be talking about set-asides, urban, rural issues if we had a sufficient number of visas. And that's fundamentally what the problem is. And when you think about it, it's almost like the program is being punished for its success.
Right.
And artificially, in my mind, because when you look at the legislation, when they said 10,000 investors, nobody, I don't think there's any support for, they thought 10,000, whatever investors plus the 2 kids and the wife and et cetera. I don't think that there was any thought of that.
John, going back 10, 12 years, I mean, it seemed like a lot of visas. There was always a lot left over. Yeah. John, do you have any comment? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel.